Dad was born in Baker City in 1932. His parents had a ranch in Unity until he was 4 when they moved to Melba because their ranch was being submerged by a new reservoir caused by the Unity Dam, which was built on the Burnt River for irrigation in the Unity area. Dad talks about how they just tore down the barns and corrals and put them on trailers and drove them to Melba. Found 80 acres just south of Walters Butte. Melba was where some relatives, Frank Roberts, lived. He homesteaded there while he was principal over at Greenleaf Academy. So they knew about Melba and found this 80 acres and settled there in 1936.
Dad was a second-generation lifetime farmer and rancher. He just loved it every day. He'd be out on his place doing something. You know, he raised a family here, my brother and I, and we were out there helping him. I don't know if we quite enjoyed it as much as he did. This wasn't just his career, it was his hobby, but we were out there with him. We learned a lot from him. When they moved from Unity, when my dad was pretty small, they bought a place in Melba. We called it the Corner Place. It was up by Walters Butte.
Dad had 2 sisters, Ruth and Carolyn, who went by Gladys, both older. Gladys loved riding horses and taught Dad a lot about horses, and at night they would escape from their rooms and head off on their horses to ride up around Walters Butte, Guffey Butte, and down to the railroad bridge.
Dad had a lot of stories from when he was growing up about him and his sisters doing things on a ranch, and some of that was, you know, they'd sneak out at night and ride their horses to Guffey Bridge or something like that. Something crazy that we would never think of doing now, or at least as parents we wouldn't. But yeah, they'd be gone all night, and he said one time that they left and rode down to Guffey Bridge at night, and Grandma felt a breeze in the house because they'd left the window open. So when they got back, she was sitting in the room waiting for them, and man, they were in trouble. Told of another time that they decided they were going to ride to Silver City, and they got to, I think they got to Sinker Creek, and figured out they weren't going to make it back that night, and they were going to be in big trouble. So they decided to turn around and come home. But that's a long ways, and again, we wouldn't think of doing anything like that now. I don't know, one memorable story he told me was, I think it was over by Guffey Railroad Bridge. Him and his sister were riding their horses, and right on the tracks back when the train went there, and wind was blowing in their face. They couldn't hear the train come around the corner behind them until he blew the whistle, and the banks were so steep they couldn't get their horses out, so they took off like crazy. He said they finally got to a place where the horses could crawl out just about the time the train went by. And yeah, he had 9 lives, and that might have been the first one there.
When Dad was in 5th grade, he started noticing Frances Farner, who was in 3rd grade. They both went to church and school together there at Melba, and apparently, as they tell it, in 3rd grade, Dad gave Mom her first box of chocolates. And they'd been an item ever since. In high school, Dad would ride by the Farner house back and forth. Apparently her room was on the corner, so he would see if her light was on. And any chance he had, he was working for the Farners, for John Farner, with especially topping corn and working out in the fields. They both attended Greenleaf Academy. Dad graduated in 1950, and Mom graduated in 1952. During the weeks, they would stay with families over there. Dad stayed with the Hockett's, and for several years, Mom stayed with the Selbys. They were married in 1952 at Melba Friends Church.
And then later on, he bought a place next to it that he put a feedlot in. And we'd finished some cattle there and also did some custom feeding. But before that, he bought a place in Donley, Idaho, and we would summer all of our cattle up there and winter them here. So growing up, I spent an awful lot of time in a cattle truck with my dad driving back and forth. We could get 18 head of cows on an old rattle trap truck, and we'd make 2 trips a day. And I don't ever remember anything going bad, but it's amazing it didn't. That just got to be too much, and he ended up selling that place, and he bought the place here where he spent the majority of his time, and where we grew up as well. And it's been a good place. It's tucked away, and you don't really see anybody or anything, and it's a great place to grow up.
Growing up on the place and working with Mom and Dad and later John was really a great childhood. Ranching was what Dad loved. He loved it from the very start. Although he said that when he was a little boy and growing up at Melba, he wanted to be a sheep herder in the Waihe Mountains. He used to watch the sheep drives go through Melba and thought it'd be wonderful to be a sheep herder up in the Waihe Mountains. But he later worked with Grandpa and obviously took over the ranch and expanded it quite a bit, not only at Melba but up in Donley. Like his dad, like Grandpa Engle, he could fix anything in the shop, or I can remember so often loading up the welder and going out in the pickup to fix some equipment out in the field. It seemed like he could always fix anything at any time. I thought it was always interesting that he got his pilot's license. He co-owned a plane with his brother-in-law, Lorne Nichols, for a time. Some of my favorite trips or times with Dad were trips that we took up to Donley in the cattle truck. He and Grandpa Engle had bought this place up in Long Valley to pasture cattle in the summer. And so in the spring, for about 2 weeks, we would load up cattle in the cattle truck and take them up to Donley. And then in the fall, we'd go up over about 2 weeks and bring them back. I loved riding in the truck with him and all the time we had going up to Long Valley. One trip I didn't take with him, but was one of his kind of 9 lives that he had. I think as we talk about Dad at the service, we're going to talk about how he had at least 9 lives where he had so many close calls. I call them guidepost moments. I think some at the service might know the magazine called Guideposts. Dad always read the Guidepost magazine about stories of how God worked and how people trusted him and just kind of real miraculous types of stories. It seemed like Dad had a number of those. And one was a day he and Grandpa went up in the truck. They didn't have any cattle, and they were actually going up to bring a small caterpillar home. They used a cat up there to ditch and that sort of thing, and they were needing to bring it home. So they went up that morning and loaded up the cat and were coming back. And as they crested the Cascade Hill, just before the long descent into Cascade, he realized he didn't have any brakes. And as he tried to shift down, he couldn't get out of neutral. I remember he said the gear shift just chattered. Couldn't get into neutral. He told Grandpa Engle to brace himself to get down because he was going to turn the truck over. And that's what he did. He found an embankment on the other side of the road, across traffic, and apparently there were no cars coming at the time, and he ran the truck up the side of an embankment, and it rolled over, and the cat rolled off and rolled down the hill, or down the road, from what I understand. And I think the truck just rolled once, and everything was quiet. He said his first goal was to see how Grandpa Engle was, and Grandpa said he was all right, and so they just stopped right there and thanked God for their safety. Dad also owned a hay chopper and did a lot of custom chopping around the valley. My job was to help him get the equipment to and from these places. He would drive the forklift tractor, and I would follow with the 806 following the hay chopper. We'd go to Laughlin's Island and across the river and all over to do custom hay chopping, mostly in the winter. I can still remember following him across that old Walters Ferry Bridge, the one-lane bridge before the new one was built. And I can still remember, pretty young, I was driving the 806 with the hay chopper, following him, just making sure I was staying on that lane. And right in the middle of the bridge, as he was driving across, his hat blew off into the river. A big gust of wind came. I always still remember that. He had a deep belief in God and in the power of prayer. And it wasn't so much a religion as much as he just simply had a trust in Jesus Christ and truly believed the scriptures. I still remember, waking up in the mornings, and there he'd be at the kitchen table with his Bible and a cup of coffee, and you could tell he had been reading scripture and praying. He just believed in God with all his heart, and he by no means was he perfect. In fact, he was the first to admit he wasn't. Often apologized, often admitted mistakes, talked about how sometimes he was bullheaded, but he would keep his heart open, or if he realized he made a mistake, he would try to make it right. I remember when the church burned down in 1972, he had already been up to the church when it was first reported. It was a record-breaking cold. Some maybe at the service were there as well and remember how cold it was. I believe it was below zero. And anyway, I woke up in the middle of the night already. He had already been up, and he had come back down to change his clothes because he was just soaked and icy. And as we were driving back up to, they were still mopping things up, he told me that when he first got there, the fellowship hall was just engulfed and just blazing. But the sanctuary, which was next to it, hadn't burned yet. And those who got there were scrambling to bring out anything they could out of the sanctuary. And once that was done, and the fire still hadn't encroached into the sanctuary, he said he went in one last time, and he just stood there. And he just remembered. He remembered how he became a Christian there, and married Mom, and had us dedicated. And anyway, it was just a moment, he said, before that part of the church burned down. Interestingly, later a new church was built, and he and his several guys from the church went to Montana and Oregon to get wood, to get lumber for the church. And I was with him on the trip to Oregon when coming back from Oregon, driving towards Vail along the Malheur River. He and some of the other guys in their trucks saw a cow apparently getting close to calving that was actually in the shallow river. That river's pretty shallow through there. And here was this cow in the water. And they stopped their trucks and waded out and moved the cow to a nearby corral. Got it safe, got some hay or whatever, and made sure it was safe. And I don't know if the cow calved then or if it did later. But they did leave a note, and I guess apparently a few weeks later, the church got a donation to the building fund from that rancher. Dad always just gave us boys the space we needed to be who we were, and he was always so proud of us. But above all, I knew he prayed for us, and I knew that came from a deep heart of faith.
I think above all, Dad was a Christian man. He believed in God. He would, every day, he would get up, he would walk to those big windows on that house and look over his land and all that he had here, and he was so happy to have it and be a part of it. And I think his daily routine was, after that, he'd make some coffee and he'd sit down and he'd read his Bible and he'd pray. And there's probably a lot of people, maybe who are watching this, that Dad prayed for them. He heard that they had some problems or something going on, they needed some prayer, and that was my dad. They probably never know it, but I know he did that, and that was a good example for us, especially growing up and seeing that. And he never really said a whole lot, but I learned a lot from him by watching him. And it was, try to have some compassion for some people and treat them good, and just be a good person. I'm sure he wished he could have done that more, but he did it quite a bit, and I think people noticed that. I sure saw it from being a kid. He had a lot of close calls over the years. Maybe people probably remember some of them. I know I sure do, but a four-wheeler got upside down on him in a canal one time and trapped him underwater, and he barely made it out of that. And cows and horses, and he got drugged one time and got beat up pretty bad. And there's one though that was real memorable to me. Was he had some medical problems, and he went into the doctor and found some spots on the inside of his organs there, and it was a pretty serious deal. And they told him to come back the next day for some more testing. And when he got home that night, first thing he did was he made some calls to some people from the church, and he asked for prayer. And they met him and they prayed for him. And I was sitting on the front row. I saw all this happen, and it had a big impact on me. But when they were done praying for him, one of them said, "Frank, I prayed that you'd be completely healed from this, and that you're going to go in there tomorrow and they're not going to find anything wrong with you." And that's exactly what happened. He went in there the next day, and the doctor said, "We don't know what happened to what we saw yesterday, but we don't see anything in there that is to be concerned about." You know, so they were scratching their head, but I don't think Dad was. He knew people prayed for him. That's all he needed. He loved it here. There's no place on earth he would have rather been than right here on his ranch, and working hard every day. A lot of times he wouldn't see hardly anybody all day long. He'd just be here working away and wouldn't have it any other way. He wasn't a wealthy man, how we measure wealth commonly anyway, but in one way he was probably the wealthiest man I know. He would just always think that if you had a good view and a nice cold drink of water and a dog to pet, you had about all you needed, and he had that. Most people look forward to a day of like vacation or hunting or shopping or something like that. We just can't wait for that day to get here. And the day finally comes and it's half gone, and you're wondering how it's going so fast, and then it's over, and you wonder where it went. Well, that was kind of every day for him. He just loved it. It just went too fast for him, and he was always looking forward to tomorrow. Life changed around here quite a bit. The middle of November 1987, I was in college, and I'd been talking back and forth with my mom on the phone. The day before, there had just been a plane crash in Denver, Colorado, and this community lost some people that day. There were some FFA students and instructor on that flight, and some didn't make it. Some were hurt real bad, and miraculously there were some that didn't get hurt too bad, kind of came out of it good. And so we'd been calling back and forth, just getting updates and things like that. We didn't have internet or anything. We kind of called back and forth on what we were hearing, and we had just hung up that evening, and she called back. She called me back a few minutes later, and she said, "John, you better head this direction. Your dad's been in a terrible accident, and they're flying him to Boise in a helicopter," and hung up. And so my dad had been at the feedlot trying to repair a nightlight up at the top of a pole over the corrals, and couldn't quite reach it, so he had a front end loader all the way up, and he was standing in the bucket of that thing, wrestling around with that light. I don't know what happened. He slipped or lost his footing somewhere, and he fell and landed on a pole fence, and bent him in half the wrong direction. Broke him up pretty good. And he showed me later, he crawled probably 20 or 30 feet, dragging himself with his elbows, and kind of gave up, I guess. But he had a little flashlight in his pocket, and it was dark by then and cold, and he'd reach up and he'd flash that flashlight at cars as they'd drive by. There's probably only 2 or 3 cars out there, but none of them saw him. But those dogs, they all sensed something was wrong, and they'd come around him there, and he'd pull them dogs up on him and try to save a little warmth. And you know, he was probably getting ready to lose consciousness and the hypothermia and everything else. I bet for a praying man, he was doing a lot of praying right then. One of them dogs, name is Zeke, kind of a notorious dog around here for us anyway, but there was a guy that lived in a house not too far away by the name of Rod Bean, and Rod Bean had a broken leg from a bronc ride that went haywire, and he was in that house, and one of those dogs named Zeke, he ran over that house and barked. Kind of like something you see out of Lassie, but I think God had something more to do with it than that. But old Rod got tired of hearing that dog bark, and eventually he went out there and hollered at the dog, and the dog left, and the dog came back and kind of back and forth. Finally Rod realized he better go see what was going on, and he followed that dog out there again on a cast and broken leg, and he went out there and found my dad, and made several trips back and forth to that house. And my dad, in fact, he broke his cast, wore the bottom of it off. They had to go put another cast on him, but he, you know, called and got help coming and took blankets out there and just stayed with him till help got there, and they headed to Boise with him. And so after getting that call, I headed back here, and I came to the ranch, and there wasn't anybody here. And when I left the house there, I noticed Dad's Bible there. I don't remember thinking about this, but apparently I did. But I grabbed that Bible and I headed for Boise, and walked into Dad's hospital room there, and he's laying there in bed not looking too good. And I said, "Daddy, you gonna make it?" And he grabbed that Bible and he says, "Yeah, I think I will now." And then he said, "You better get out there that feedlot, put that tractor away, because if you don't, it's not going to start in the morning, and you got to feed." So that's what I did. And that doctor, the surgeon that did the surgery on him, said that they put a bunch of pins in him, and then he said they had these bolts, and they had hooks on the end of them. They were going to put them over his vertebrae, had a nut on it, and they were going to tighten that nut down and hold everything together there on his backbone, his vertebrae. And Dad told him, he said, "Hey, do me a favor, when you get that nut on there where you want it, booger them threads on that bolt so that nut doesn't come off." And the doctor agreed. Told us later that's what he did. So Dad never came apart, so it must have worked. I guess that doctor must have had a little farmer in him too. When he got released from that hospital, they sent him over to the Elks Rehab there in Boise and rolled him in there in a wheelchair, or maybe a stretcher, I don't know. But the doctors and everybody there, they started preparing him for not ever walking again. And of course he didn't want to hear that, and he told them, "I'm going to walk out the front doors here." And one of them doctors said, "Frank, that's exactly the type of attitude that's going to make the difference, and that's something I can't give you." And you know, he did. He walked out of there. It was a lot of time and a lot of effort in between, but he walked out of there and never stopped. On his way out, though, he invited everybody there at that Elks to come out to the ranch for a barbecue, and boy, we put on a big deal out here, and there was a lot of them that showed up, and we had a good time, good food, and a lot of tears. We all learned a lot during those years and that time dealing with Dad's injury. And you know, one thing that was memorable to me was while he was over there trying to get healed up, and I was out here trying to keep things going. One day I saw the neighbors coming down the road with loaders and spreader trucks and tractors and quite a few of them. And they had got together and decided that they were going to come down and help out. And they cleaned the pens and hauled it out to the fields and spread it and worked it in. And there's a whole bunch of them. It was Ray Montgomery and Kramers and Paul Jacinko and Ralph Gant and Bill Young and Melvin Thiel, Dennis Charters, Phil Pease. I can't remember all of them, but I think that's most of them. But you know, that made it very evident to me of why we live here in this community. That made a big impact. I was a pretty young guy at the time, but just the thoughts of people doing that takes a couple things. It takes a lot of good people who are willing to do that for a good person, and they sure helped us. He had a limp. Most of everybody knows, you know, that saw him here in last year's. He had a limp ever since that deal, but he moved pretty slow, but he walked, and he never really said a whole lot about pain or anything like that. In fact, we'd kind of forget about it. We'd try to hurry him up every once in a while. He'd let us know. He'd say, every step that I take hurts, and you just didn't ever see it. I guess you'd see it when it get real bad. His lower lip would quiver. We knew he was probably dealing with quite a bit of pain at the time. But yeah, he got up and just kept going every day. He enjoyed people, which is kind of ironic for living in a place where there's not a lot of people around that he would see every day, but he'd sure like visiting with friends and family, and the kids come over, he'd give them four-wheeler rides, and they'd think that was a big deal. But he did enjoy people, and they didn't really, my mom and dad didn't really do a whole lot of traveling. They did some, but mainly everything they wanted was just kind of right here, and so they spent a lot of time here. And I think their idea, Dad's idea of a family outing was to go out and build fence or change the water or do something like that. But later in life, he really enjoyed being around a coffee table with friends and neighbors, and they'd all get around a table every morning and drink coffee and talk, and man, he enjoyed that. He'd always tell me he needed to go down there and get his daily dose of abuse. Kind of a joke, but he sure thought a lot of all them guys. And you know, even after he left here for 6 years ago or whatever, but whenever he'd call or I'd talk to him, he'd always ask about them guys, want to know what they were up to and how everybody's doing, and you know, he really missed that, and those guys had a lot of good impact on him, and I hope he did on them as well. To be part of a community, you really have to give back to the community in some way or another. One of the ways my dad did that over the years was in the fire service. He was a fire commissioner here for 18 years. He did a good job. It's not easy. They commit a lot of time, a lot of personal time to it, and make some decisions that most people don't realize greatly impacts them when they have an emergency. It's been something our family and extended family has been involved with for several decades, and being involved with it myself, it's great to see that what's possible now was put in place by Dad and those guys back then who were laying the groundwork for it. Commissioners now are doing the same thing for the next generation to come, trying to figure out what we need, but I'm proud of him for that. After he retired, you'd rarely see him without a hat or coat or something that said Melba Fire Department on it. He flew the flag right up till the very end.
I'd like to fast forward to the last 7 years of Dad's life. It's interesting because I knew the first part as I grew up at Melba, but after I went to college out at George Fox, I didn't come home very often. I was home for 2 or 3 years and then have stayed out here at Newburgh ever since. So when Mom and Dad decided to move out to Friendsview, where I work, in 2011, we were delighted but kind of surprised. But yet it seemed like it would work well in that they could have an apartment where I work and here in Newburgh, and still be able to go back to the ranch and keep an eye on things and work with John and Jackie and see them and the family, see their friends and family there. But it wasn't really until after they moved here, after a few months, that I realized that probably a bigger part of that was coming out to be a support to me and my 2 boys. Patsy had just died, my first wife, the year before, and Tim was in college, but Aaron was still home. And I'll tell you, now that I look back on it, having the folks out here just was a lifesaver. It was so wonderful to have family here and to enjoy Sunday dinners together, to go to the beach. We'd hop in the van and away we'd go to the beach, or go up to Crater Lake, went to Seattle, trips to California. They really had some freedom to be able to travel, and I had time, and so we had some great trips together. But as much as they enjoyed being out here and also reconnecting with some friends that they'd known from Greenleaf, Melba was home. And I always felt sorry for the doctor's office receptionist or the nurse when they'd ask Dad, now where do you live again? And he'd clear his throat and say, well, I have an apartment in Newburgh, but I own property in Melba, Idaho. That's where I'm from. And I always smiled and thought, that's exactly right. His heart is at Melba. He's out here part of the time, and he was over at Melba part of the time, but his heart was at Melba. In some ways, Melba and the ranch came to Friendsview. 2 examples. One is a 1951 Chevy pickup. Now, Mom and Dad had a 1951 Chevy pickup when they first got married. It was nearly brand new, and that was their first vehicle. They sold it, but later in the 70s, they bought another 51 Chevy. I think Dad talks about how he was along the road and he worked with the guy who owned it to pull it home, and we just used it around the ranch for years. When they had their 35th wedding anniversary, we had Rick and Ricky and some of the Farner family get it running, paint it, and it looked pretty great, and had it for their 35th wedding anniversary. And then it sat for a while. So when they were out here in Newburgh, John brought it out. He hauled it out to Newburgh, and we tried to find a mechanic and someone to get it running again, and it kind of sat for a while until a friend of ours, Dave Woolsey, and some Newburgh mechanics said, let's get this thing running for Frank Engle Sr. And so that they did. They worked down in a shop and got it running. Even one guy bought a sign for the side of it, said Stagecoach Ranch on it, and got it running. And during good weather, Dad and I would take it out about once a week, going on drives through the farmland, especially in nut orchards. He loved getting in that pickup, and off we'd go down the road. Sometimes we'd get stranded. We had a lot of fun with stories of whether it would run or not, and how I was driving and all, but we had so much fun with that thing. And even just up until a couple weeks before he passed away, we would bundle him up in his wheelchair, go outside, and I'd have the pickup out there, and he'd say, hey Frank, let's start it up and see how it runs. And he wouldn't ride in it, but he would admire it, and he'd listen to how it was running, and it was a great memory all the way through. I'll always be glad for that pickup.
Dad knew that life here on earth was temporary. He's a Christian man, and God promises eternal life for those who follow Him, believe in Him, and that was Dad. He, we all have eternity coming, and it's up to us to determine where we're going to spend it. And Dad's life here on earth is over, but eternal life for him is going pretty good right now, I'd say. And for the first time in a long time, every step he takes doesn't hurt. I like thinking about that. He had a Bible verse posted on the wall near the bed where he spent his last days here on earth and took his last breath. It was Isaiah 41:10, and God's telling us not to be afraid because He's with us, and not to be worried because He's God, and that He'll strengthen us and He'll hold us up with His righteous right hand. I never really understood that till now with Dad gone. It makes a lot more sense. That's just since his accident, that's how he was able to get up and keep going every day.
I think it might be appropriate to share about Dad's last day before he went to heaven. We've talked about how he's been a man of faith and these guidepost moments where God did things in miraculous ways. When I got to his room on Thanksgiving morning, the nurse caught me and said, this might be the day. He's breathing heavier, he's pretty unresponsive, and this might be the day he goes to heaven. So I was there and decided let's play some songs, some hymns, and just be with him. And Mom came in often and would hold his hand, and it was really a precious time together. I knew he was aware because when I would lean in to tell him how much we loved him and to pray for him and all, I could tell he was hearing, and especially, and this is what I want to share at the service, so when I would say, Dad, I know that your family and friends at Melba are praying for you, there would be a tear. That happened about 3 times. Whenever I said that, a big tear would roll down his cheek. As evening came, the nurse came in and suggested I take a break, and so I thought, I kind of want to still be with him, but I think I will take a break. We have at Friendsview what we call the spiritual care team, and there are people, residents, who volunteer 1-hour shifts to sit with people who are near death when their family needs to get some rest. And so I said, yeah, why don't you go ahead and call them? So for 1-hour intervals, they came in and sat with Dad while I went home and got some rest. In some ways, I wondered when I left if Dad might go to heaven when I was gone. I started getting that sense more and more because I think he knew that with some of the other deaths I've gone through, that maybe slipping away while I was gone might be a gift to me. And sure enough, just soon after I'd gone to sleep, I got a call, and he had passed away actually around midnight, about actually 12:45 the next morning on that Friday. It was the next day when I met with a couple of the women who had been with him. He passed away kind of towards the end of an hour, so I met with these 2 women. One was Millie Laughlin and Elenita Bales. Now, Elenita Bales is probably 97 or more, and she was a Marduk and raised at Melba, and remembers Dad as a young boy when she was going through Melba High School. And here she was living at Friendsview and with Dad when he passed away. And I thought, that's another moment where I think God was so gracious, because here's someone from Melba who was with him. But the other woman who had been with him just before Elenita got there, been with him for an hour or so, or close to it, was Millie. A wonderful saint, I think. She's just a wonderful woman. And she said that as she sat there with Dad, just watching him, and he was struggling more with breath, and she was, making sure the nurse was aware and giving him more medication. She said that as she got near the end of her shift, she just looked up to the heavens and said, Lord, don't you think it's just time to take him home? Lord, please take him home now. And she said that within a minute, Dad did take his last breath. And it was a sense of release that I think Dad was needing, and the Lord lovingly intervened and just took him home so he didn't have to struggle any longer. When Mom and I got there, it was a real blessing because he looked so peaceful, and we sat there for a while. It seemed like in some ways he was still in the room. And Mom especially just was so touched by how peaceful he looked. And as we sat there, we just realized that the reality was he was on his way to heaven, getting ready to hear, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant."
How do you sum up a guy's life? A guy like him, I hope that some of this does justice to him. My mom used to tell me, usually when something went haywire or I goofed something up, she'd say, "John, you're just like your dad." Well, that has a lot different meaning now than it did back then, but I sure hope she's right. He was a good guy, and I'm going to miss him.
My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. I dare not trust the sweetest frame, but wholly lean on Jesus' name. On Christ the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand. When darkness seems to hide his face, I rest on his unchanging grace. In every high and stormy gale, my anchor holds within the veil. On Christ the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand. His oath, his covenant, his blood support me in the whelming flood. When all around my soul gives way, he then is all my hope and stay. On Christ the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand. When he shall come with trumpet sound, oh, may I then in him be found, dressed in his righteousness alone, faultless to stand before the throne. On Christ the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand. On Christ the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand. All other ground